Okay, in this tutorial I want to reintroduce you guys to the assets that will be associated with this project, and also talk about how to import one Maya scene into another Maya scene. On top of that, I'd like to address some ways that you can approach animating the bowling ball itself in this particular project. The first thing I'm going to do is click on File and come down and set my project location. I'll select my bowling package, so that way when I go to open with Command or Control O, it automatically defaults to my scenes folder. Now you'll see that there's a number of different Maya scenes that are part of this folder. We're going to specifically focus on the bowling ball rig. We will focus on the bowling pin rig, and then we will also focus on the lane right here. So if I open up the bowling ball rig, you're going to see that it is set up exactly the same as the bouncing ball that you have previously animated. Right? We have the animation handle right here that has a squash and stretch custom attribute. You have the bowling ball itself that you can animate independently of the animation handle right here. All right? And then also, this particular object is a little bit more specific as to the theme. So you have the bowling ball with the holes, and it has some texture, as is seen in the color of the bowling ball, the black inside the holes, and the logo right here in between the finger holes, and also the weight specified on the back of the ball. You feel free to alter those textures just simply by going to the source images folder, finding the bowling ball texture, opening it up in Photoshop, and modifying it. All you have to do is save it in Photoshop, and then the next time that you open up this particular Maya scene, it will automatically update that texture. All right, now I'm going to go to Open with Command or Control O once again, and I'll open up the bowling pin rig. Okay, when this opens up right here, you're going to just be presented with something just simple, this bowling pin rig. And you'll notice that if you select the actual object itself and try and translate it or rotate it or scale it, and I'm accessing those handles just by pressing W, E, and R on my keyboard, they're grayed out, meaning that they're locked. You cannot alter this skeletal mesh or the object or the model for this particular asset. Instead, click on the animation handle down here at the bottom, and then you can go ahead and you can translate it and you can rotate it. That's a little bit more noticeable. You can scale it, you can do what you need to, but also pay particular attention to these custom attributes right here. All right, now the way that these custom attributes are going to work is because this particular object has actually been rigged. If I press 4 on my keyboard, it allows me to see the wireframe of the skeletal mesh and to see the actual, think of it like a spine that's running up through this bowling pin. And now what happens is when I come over here to the right left bend, I'll just click on the name of the attribute, middle mouse click and scrub back and forth, is it bends that skeleton, all right? And the way that it bends the skeleton and the way that that skeleton is attached to the actual model itself, the model bends and deforms along with it, all right? So we can bend side to side, we can bend forwards and backwards. I'm going to just bend forward just a little bit, and then I can twist it, back and forth. And then also we have the ability to squash and stretch that object too. And those are all keyable attributes. And through the combination of animating those, coupled with the translate, the rotate, and the scale, you can get an awful lot of character out of this particular model. All right, I turn the textures back on by pressing number 6 on my keyboard. Okay, now I'll hit Command or Control O, and actually before I come in and talk about the lane, I'm going to open up this file right here, 10 pins unrigged. All right, and here you go. You have all these pins grouped together. Now you can select these pins individually if you need to for whatever reason, or you can select them as a group by selecting the handle. Now if you notice, each one of these, or none of these pins have a little animation handle going around the bottom. If I press 4, you can see that none of them actually have a skeletal system. These are unrigged. They are just simply objects. All right, and you would probably be using these in the event that you just want a bowling ball, hit a bowling pin, and the bowling pin to fly around without trying to squash and stretch and anticipate and jump out of the way. All right, and then also you have, whoops, that's the wrong file. You have the 10 pins rigged, which I'll open up right here, where you have your bowling pins, and they're in the same configuration as the file we just looked at. You have the master handle where we can move them around as a group, then you have individual handles, you can move them around independently of one another, or you can animate them you know, with their custom skeletons. So each one of these bowling pins has its own skeleton. Now something that is kind of fun that you can do is you can select multiple bowling pins simultaneously, and you can actually animate them together. You know, if for whatever reason you needed some choreography with some bowling pins, or you know, what have you, that is an option as well. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next scene, which is the actual backdrop. All right, so it's the lane.mb. I won't save this. And here is what is going to open up. You see you have a single lane. It's a full lane. You have this area leading up to the foul line. You actually have the bowling deck, and then you have the marquee here in the background. Now you notice I can't click on it. I can't do anything. The reason for that is because this particular Maya scene is set up to take advantage of layers. Now the layers is the lower section of the channel box editor. So right down here, you'll see 3 different layers: a single lane full, single lane partial, and multiple lanes. This R is actually the toggle for locking that layer. All right. And this V is a toggle for toggling off and on the visibility of said layer. So we'll go ahead and turn off the single lane full, turn on the single lane partial, if for whatever reason your concept necessitates this, or you can turn on multiple lanes, which is what I will be working with for this particular tutorial. All right, so I've selected the lane scenario that I want to animate around, and now I'm going to click on File and come down to Import, where you can see the shortcut key is going to be Command or Control-I. So I'll release that, and for the moment I am going to come down to 10 pins unrigged and hit Open. All right, when these open up, they should automatically open up in the spot in which they need to go. All right, which is right there at the end of one of our bowling lanes. Now, go ahead and toggle off or on the outliner. Now, for whatever reason, Maya's configured a little differently here than it normally is. So I'm going to open up the outliner by clicking on this little toggle switch here. I'm actually going to redock it over there on the side. The outliner basically provides a list view to all the objects and the relationships between those objects in your Maya scene. So you can see that here, you know, I have a multiple lanes object, I have a partial lanes, a single lane object that correspond with the objects that are in these particular layers. And then also I have this group handle, which corresponds to this configuration of 10 bowling pins. If I click on the expansion, you can see each of the individual pins right here. But I'm going to go ahead and collapse that and focus on them as a group. Now, something that you can do if you want to populate the back of all of these bowling lanes with more pins is I can select the group by selecting the group handle and pressing Command or Control D as in duplicate. Now, this is where the outliner is necessary because I created a duplicate, but it exists in this exact same place as the original instance of those bowling pins. So it's kind of hard to see where they're at. You know, and if you unselect it, you know, you're not going to know that you have 2 objects there until you start moving things around and you confuse yourself because suddenly you have multiples. What I'm going to do is, you know, when I duplicated it, you can see that it created group_handle1, which is the duplicate group. And now I can take that and I can actually translate it over here to lane 1. Now, each one of these lanes is spaced, or the center of each one of these lanes is spaced about 6 units apart from one another. So because of that, in my channel box editor, I can just set that positional value for -12 on the translate X. All right. I can duplicate that again, bring it over here, change that value to -6. I can duplicate it again, bring it over here, change that value to +6, duplicate it one more time, bring it over here, change that value to +12, and now I have bowling pins at the end of each one of my alleys. All right, so this is a good point to hit or to click on File, come down to Save Scene As or Command-Shift-S and I'm going to go ahead and call this animation work in progress. And now we will go to File, Import, and we are going to import our bowling ball. Now you notice when the bowling ball imports, it's set at a different scale than everything else. And for the purposes of this demo, I'm kind of happy that this isn't the issue that we have to deal with, because most likely you will deal with a similar issue at some point in setting up your animation scene. So the first thing I'm going to do is, if you get in here and take a close look, you can actually see the animation handle exists kind of below the bowling deck, but we can see it in the gutters. All right, I'm going to raise that up just a little bit so it's actually above the animation deck, and the actual specific height for that is 0.031, and then it's just going to sit right there, just barely on that deck. Now I will take that full handle. Make sure you have the animation handle and not just the bowling ball, or else you're going to screw things up. Let's go ahead and take this animation handle and pull it all the way back to about the foul line. Okay, this is the line you're not supposed to step over when you're bowling. And you'll notice that I can't scale this object down, all right? And it's because of this custom squash and stretch attribute, because it's overriding the regular scale X, scale Y, and scale Z attributes. Instead, I'm going to click on the child, which is the bowling ball itself, and I'm going to scale that down from the center. And I'm actually going to scale that down to about 0.15. Whoops, it would help if I did that on all of these. All right, scale it down to about 1.15, and it's going to be at a relative appropriate scale for the rest of our environment. And then I'm manually going to lower this down and just place it to where it's just barely, if anything, just barely clipping through the bottom of the deck. And I can actually swing my camera around to the underside of that and see just how much of it is clipping through, and raise it up just a hair, about like so. I'll press F on my keyboard to center my camera on it. All right, I'm going to grab the animation handle and just pull it back past that, that foul line just a little. And now we're good to go, and we're ready to start doing some animation. I'm going to save this again just for good measure. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually set up my timeline for the animation. So at the moment, you see that I'm only seeing 24 frames, but there's this little slider here at the bottom that as I move it over, it shows that my timeline maxes out at 48 frames. I'm actually going to change this to 72 frames, and we do that by basically changing the values in these two fields. This says that we're only going to see 24 frames at a time, and this shows the full duration of the timeline. If I change this first field to 72, it's automatically going to push the second field to 72 as well. And you'll see that I can't scrub this little scroll bar back and forth anymore. All right, so that's what our animation is going to play out as, is at the 72 frames. So I'll go back to frame 1, and this is going to be animating along the z-axis. All right, so the z-axis is going to be our depth axis, and I know that because of this little kind of compass orientation icon down in the lower left-hand corner. And also, these little handles are always going to point in the positive axis, and so that also lets us know that we need to animate this going backwards along the negative axis. All right, so at frame 1, I will right-click on Translate Z, and I'm going to go ahead and key that, and then I'll go down to frame 72, and I'll push it all the way. Whoops, hang on, let me back up. I almost mess things up. I want to grab the animation handle, not the child. All right? I can't stress that enough. So I will key the translate here now. So that is keyed. Now I'll go over to frame 72. I'll go ahead and push it down to the point where it would be colliding with these pins. Now it automatically keyed that because we have the auto key toggle turned on. And so if I go to the beginning and hit play, it's as easy as that. All right, animating that ball. Now if I want to do some stuff that's a little more fun, a little bit more bold, I can play around with simultaneously animating an X translation, which would be this red axis, so some back and forth. So maybe we actually start, I'm going to key the translate X right here and move it over about like so. All right. I'm going to come down to frame 72. I'm actually going to push it so it hits about that pocket right there. And then at frame 36, I'm actually going to move it over to the point where it is almost falling in the gutter. And now as a result of this, as I scrub through this timeline, you know, it's going to be like you're putting a backspin on that ball, or, you know, enough of a spin to have it actually curve and hit that sweet spot right there. Okay, so if I hit play, you know, it's going to produce a nice effect. Now, the one thing that's happening that I'm still not a huge fan of is I don't like the slow out as a bowling ball is hitting the pin. In fact, you know, if it's going to slow into that position, it's not going to connect with the same intensity that you would imagine a bowling ball to have as it interacts with those pins. And I can fix that through the graph editor. So I'll click on Windows, come down to Animation Editor, select the graph editor. I'm going to take the graph editor and I want to dock it here at the bottom of my regular viewport. I'm going to select the main animation handle and hit escape there so it's not currently animating. I'll select the translate X. Actually, I'm going to start with the translate Z. I'll select this animation handle right here. I'm just going to manually adjust it like that. So it is, you know, it kind of has its maximum velocity when it gets to that point. I'll probably take the translate X and do the same thing with that final keyframe. I imagine I'd leave this one right here alone. So it kind of, you know, I think I want it to ease into that position right there. And so now, when I back out and I hit play, the timing should feel better. All right, so that's one way that you can go about animating this ball. But there's another way that sometimes might actually end up being a little bit more appropriate. All right, so I'm actually going to go select the animation handle, go to frame 1, and I'll select Translate X and Translate Z, and I'll delete those keyframes. I want to make sure that I only have Translate X and Z selected, not Scale X and Y. Otherwise, you'll mess up your squash and stretch attribute. Okay, this additional way of being able to animate it is to actually draw the path that the ball will go down and then essentially tell it to follow that path. Now this will be done by clicking on this icon over here. So go to our 4 viewport mode. I'm going to hover my mouse over top of the top view and tap my spacebar so that is maximized. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, you know, to the point where I can see the full length of my bowling lane in the top view. Now click on the Curves tab right up here at the top. By default, it's generally going to be set to polymodeling, or it might be set to animation, but we're going to go ahead and go to Curves. And we're going to use this icon right here, the Bezier Curve tool. And this tool works a lot like the pen tool in Illustrator. All right, maybe I'll zoom in just a little bit, and I'm going to draw a little point, or I'll click right here about where the ball is. And now I'm going to go to another point and click and hold and drag. And I'm actually going to draw out a Bezier curve that's going to control how this line that I'm drawing comes into that point. All right, and click and hold and drag, click and hold and drag, click and hold and drag, click and hold and drag. All right, just play around with it until you end up getting a path that looks fun. Now, if you need to go back and kind of adjust some of these points a little bit more, just go ahead and click on that point. And bring that over here. Adjust that curve a little bit more. All right, and when you're done, go ahead and just press return, and then you will make this an active path. Now, if you do need to go back to edit again, you can select that same tool, and those points will still be there, they'll still be active, and so you can continue to edit it, all right? But I'm just going to, once again, press return to recommit that. Now I'm going to go over to my perspective view. Now, one problem that we have is that as we drew down from the top view, it drew that line on the top of our grid, all right? So if I toggle off the visibility on the multiple lanes, turn on my grid right here, you can see that it's sitting squarely on top of that grid. So I'm going to turn the visibility back on, make sure I have that curve selected. I'm going to raise it a little bit. If you remember previously, the height that we were talking about to get it to sit right on top of that deck is 0.031. All right. This way, so when we tell the ball to follow this curve, it's not going to drop the ball down lower into the deck, you know. So, all right, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I hope that made sense. So now what we need to do is just kind of formally tell the animation handle, you know, and by default the child, to follow this curve. And we do it by selecting the animation handle, then holding down Shift and selecting the curve. It's important that we select it in that sequence. You select the object that is to follow, and then you select the object that will be followed second. You're going to want to click on your drop down right up here, make sure you have the animation subset of the program selected. Then come over to Constrain, come down to Motion Paths. We will do Attach to Motion Path, but make sure that you select the option box because we want to tweak some of these settings first. All right, you could do the time range for the time slider, meaning that it would start at frame 1 and it would end at frame 72. Or you could tell it just to start at frame 22 if for whatever reason you need a little bit of a pause. On this case, we're going to do a start and end. So I will tell it to start at 16 frames, and then I'm going to have it end at, let's see, I'm going to have it end at 66 frames right there. All right, so now the animation is going to be about 50 frames long. So, you know, that'll actually happen over about 2 seconds. You want to make sure that you're very specific with these right here, the front axis. That basically is referring to the direction that the object is going, you know, in this particular case, the bowling ball is going to be facing. We want the front axis to be the z-axis because the z-axis represents the depth of the lane itself. All right, you want the up axis to be set to the world axis, which is y. And then in this particular case, you know, if you remember, the handles always point in the positive direction. We want to inverse the front, meaning that the bowling ball is going to go this way as opposed to this way right here. So I think I have everything set up the way I need it to be, and I'll go ahead and hit attach, and now I should be able to hit play and watch that bowling ball fly down that path. Now the way that this works is if I scrub through the timeline, watch these values for the translate values and for the rotate values. Okay, you can see that they're constantly changing. The reason for that is because these values are being generated as per where the bowling ball exists at that particular point in time, at that particular point along that curve. Basically, these values are now being overridden by the function that we just performed. You don't want to come in and mess around with these values, or you could screw the animation up. The nice thing is even though those values are being overridden, we can still have a certain degree of control over the way that this is playing out on our timeline. Because if you paid attention, we got a new input for this object, this motion path 1 input. If you click on that, it actually expands, and you see this thing called a U value. You know, so the U value, you know, kind of goes from 0, meaning the starting point, to 1, which is the ending point. And that U value in our graph editor is actually present as well, and we can control it. You know, this is showing us that we have a slow out. This is showing us that we have a slow in. I could actually come to the slow in and change the angle of that graph, so now we don't lose momentum as it comes into that stopping point right there. And also, like, I could come into a position like maybe right here in the animation and say at frame 41, I want to put a little emphasis on that. So I can just right click on the U value here and set a new animation key, click on that key in the graph editor and change it like this. And so now we're going to have a slow out of, you know, this first keyframe, a slow into and slow out of the second keyframe, and then this final keyframe, it's just kind of a straight shot into it, so it'll stay kind of nice and snappy. So if I go back to the beginning of my timeline and hit play, you know, you see how it kind of pauses right there. You know, and maybe it pauses a little too much. So I just want to change the angle of that just a little bit more. All right, I like it. I like how that looks. Now, something else that we can do to bring just a little bit more believability to this ball is we can make it rotate. All right. So I'm going to select the ball itself, not the actual animation handle, because now that those rotate values are being overridden by the curve, don't want to do anything else with that. So let's select just the bowling ball. Select the child, and we're going to have the child operate independently of everything else. So right here at frame 16, I am going to set a value for rotating along the x-axis, or not set a value, set a keyframe. So I'll right-click, key that one at 0, and then when we come right down here to frame 66, I'm going to try rotating this 720 degrees, so that's 2 full revolutions, that's 360 times 2. All right, and as we watch this play, I'm going to deselect it and try and watch it. Oh, that is really hard to tell what's going on. Okay, so it looks like I have a backspin as opposed to a forward spin on it. So let's go ahead and select that ball again. Come back over to frame 66. We'll change that to negative 720. All right, and watch that. All right, and I don't think the bowling ball is quite spinning quickly enough for the speed in which it's moving. So I'll select that bowling ball again, come over to frame 66 and change that value to negative 1440. All right, so now it's going to rotate a full 4 revolutions. All right, and I think it's a little hard to tell, but I think that's a lot more believable. Okay, now one problem that we have is at the moment that bowling ball is rotating at a pretty consistent rate, and when it's actually the translation slows down right here, it makes a bowling ball feel kind of like it's slipping and sliding. So what we want to do is we want to go to, I think it was frame 41, where we had set the the extra keyframe for the translation or for the ball following that actual curve. We'll go to frame 41, and I will right-click and key that right there. I will take this value, and I am going to actually kind of play around with the curve a little bit and make it slow down here. So it slows down in a way that's complementary to the pathing and speed of the object. All right, I'm liking how that's looking. I'm going to actually turn on a little bit of motion blur in my preview. We'll go ahead and save right here. Okay, there we go. I don't know why it's not wanting to let me play. Sometimes Maya just kind of glitches out on us. And all right, well, what we're going to do now is I'm gonna hit save again and try and reopen this scene and see if that will take care of the issue. Really not sure what is going on. Give me just a second. Okay, it's working now. Maya was glitching out. I paused the video and tried to troubleshoot it, and Maya promptly crashed. So I just reopened it, and the preview is working just fine now. All right. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about animating cameras. And instead of animating this camera that I'm currently looking through, I'm going to create a new custom camera specifically for this application. I'm going to start by clicking on Panels, come down to Perspective, and choose New. All right, and so now we have this new camera, and we're looking through the camera. We're moving the camera around in the space, and something that I'm going to do is kind of show you guys how to establish a little bit of a novelty shot with this camera. Before I do it, let's also focus on the framing of the camera itself. Right here, I can click on a little toggle switch for that basically shows us what the camera sees. It's called the film gate. So everything that's within this film gate is going to be rendered. Everything outside of it will not. Now, the camera itself is currently selected. If it's not, you can turn on your outliner and you can select the perspective one. I'm going to change the horizontal film aperture to 1.6 by 0.9, and then that will actually give us a widescreen 16 by 9 aspect ratio. Now I'm going to just zoom in really close here, and what we're going to do is we're going to do a POV shot where the camera is actually attached to the bowling ball. So compositionally the bowling ball will stay in the same place, but everything else will move around it. And that's actually done as simply as selecting the camera, then using Shift and selecting the animation handle, and I'm going to hit P as in Paul or parent on my keyboard, and now that camera is parented to the ball. So when I hit play, it's kind of fun. It's a little weird because the bowling ball doesn't really rotate much on the y-axis, but you know, it really is also kind of overstimulating for my eyeballs. Just a little too much motion going on right there. Something like this works great when you're figuring out a way to kind of balance the staging with, you know, the object that remains stationary, you know, juxtaposed with the environment that's moving around it. But this is one thing that you can do with this camera. It's really, really cool. Now I'm actually going to hit escape, and I'm going to come back here to this 16 frame mark because just in this particular instance, it's just not working. I'm going to, in my outliner, expand the null object so that I have access to the perspective one camera, and I'm going to hit Shift P as in parent. And now that camera is no longer parented to that animation handle. And instead I'm going to animate it independently from the ball. So right here at frame, actually, you know, I'm going to do it about frame 20, I think. I am going to key the translate, all the translate and all the rotate values. So I'll select them all. And I did that with the Shift select. Right click and key those at this particular point. And then when the bowling ball comes right down here, you know, the bowling ball comes to its resting place at frame 66. Maybe we'll actually catch up with it at frame 69. So I've moved to that point right there, frame 69. And now I'll just navigate my camera down here, you know, and maybe kind of play around a little bit with the camera placement. So in addition to moving down the alley, it's actually rotating a little bit. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, if you remember at frame 41, the bowling ball kind of does that little bit of a loop-de-loop. So maybe what we'll do is at frame 41, we'll just kind of back this off of here. All right. You know, and actually, I'm going to select these, and instead of having it back off at frame 41, let's have it back off about frame 45. So with those selected, all I need to do in the outliner is actually change that value from 41 to 45. And I'm just trying to keep the bowling ball in frame. All right, maybe we need to move that back a little bit more. Let's try pushing it back to frame 50. Oh, I like it. I like it a lot. That makes me really happy. Okay, so that's another way, you know, that we can have some fun. And because we have the bowling ball moving and we have the camera moving, we start getting a little overlapping action, and the animation is produced between the two elements coming together. And it makes it feel so much more immersive and so much more dynamic. Now, when we were in class, one of you asked, well, what would I do if I were to have a cut? You know, so if we cut from like one shot, so like let's say maybe right here about frame 42, we want to cut from this camera position at frame 42 to another camera position. So at 42, I'll actually go ahead and key that, and I'm going to delete all the keyframes that come after it now. And then just right at frame 43, let's just put the camera in a completely different place. You know, so now oops, I want to get back to frame 43. So immediately cut from here to here. And that's essentially how you would manage a cut. All right, good luck. I'm super excited to see what you guys are going to do.